Hello, Christchurch. How are you all doing? It's good to have you with us on this next edition of the Daily Connect, our journey through John's Gospel. Our reading today is John chapter 12, verses 1 to 19. I would love you to get hold of a Bible and to find that passage. And our passage today is two different stories, but they both have a common theme of worship. What is worship? It's actually hard to describe sometimes, isn't it? And yet we are all made to worship. All of us in different ways worship something, whether we have faith or not. I know people have no faith who worship football teams, or their spouse, or their kids, or their job, or themselves. And we all know people like that, don't we? Worship is part of who we are. And when it's hard to describe worship, sometimes we need to look at stories about worship to help us understand it better. And these two stories do something of that for us. So I'd love you to go to John chapter 12, verses 1 to 19, and read that passage. I'm going to pray for you before you do. Lord, I pray for my friends that as they read this passage, your Holy Spirit would shine a light on them and on this passage and stir their hearts to worship Jesus. Amen. So press pause now and read the passage and then restart when you've finished. So what do we have here? Well, Jesus has now been made an outlaw. We heard in the previous passage the chief priests and Pharisees had issued an order that he should be arrested. It's no longer safe for him to be out. And so where does he go? He goes to a safe place, the home of Mary, Martha and Lazarus. We assume it's their home. It doesn't say that it is, but what it does say is that a feast was put on for Jesus and Martha served. So we assume it's their home. And in this passage, the first part of it, we see three different characters, each in some way saying something about worship. The first one is Martha. What's to say about Martha? Two words: Martha served. That says everything we know about Martha, doesn't it? She was the one who was always busy, always doing things. And we all know people like that. You might be one of them. And sometimes Martha gets a bit of a bad rep, doesn't she? You know, people say, Mary, she's the one who's always at Jesus' feet and she's the one who wants to be with Jesus. But we are all made differently. And to serve is worship. What we know here is that this meal was given in honour of Jesus. And why wouldn't it be? He had just raised Lazarus from the dead. You'd want to put on a big feast for him, wouldn't you? And you can imagine Martha trying to do the absolute best she can just to say thank you to Jesus for what he did for her brother. It's remarkable, isn't it? But here is Martha worshipping. She is doing it for others in honour of Jesus. And if you're the kind of person who just likes to do things for other people, you can turn that into worship by doing it in honour of Jesus. Not doing it for yourself. Because sometimes we're like that, aren't we? We know that doing nice things for other people makes us feel good. But when we're simply doing it for Jesus and in honour of his name, it becomes worship. You are living a life of worship by serving others. Never get caught in the comparison of looking at others on a Sunday morning when they sing. Do you remember Sunday mornings, how it used to be? Seems like a long time ago. But we get caught, don't we? We look at those people with their hands in the air and their eyes closed, and you can tell they're just in love with Jesus. And you think, why can't I be like that? If you're made to serve, then serve. Use that as your worship. Do it in honour of Jesus. Do it in his name. Do it to the best of your ability. And let that be part of your worship too. If God made you that way, then worship out of that. The next person is Mary. And of course, Mary does an extraordinary thing here. She takes some perfume worth a year's wages. That's incredibly expensive, isn't it? And pours it over Jesus' feet and wipes it with her hair. There are two things I want you to notice here. First of all, just the extravagance and the costliness of this act. And sometimes, we need to make sure that when we are worshipping, whether that's in song or service or whatever the way, that we are doing it wholeheartedly. Anything less is not worship. If you come on a Sunday morning and just mumble the songs, disconnected from what they mean, you are not really worshipping, you're singing. Worship is extravagance. It's giving your all to Jesus. It's holding nothing back. And of course, it was costly. It was costly. And there are times in our lives when worship should be costly. Worship should not always be easy. We've all experienced those times where we've got up thinking, oh, I just don't want to worship Jesus today. I don't want to go to church. I don't want to go and serve. I don't feel like it. And yet stepping out and doing those things is worship, because what you are saying is that worshipping Jesus, serving others, is more important to me than how I feel. That's real worship. That's costly worship. Costly worship is when you feel like life is against you and terrible things are happening around you or to you. When you feel anxious, alone, isolated, and yet still step out to worship, you are saying that worshipping Jesus, that Jesus himself is more important to you than all those other things. That's costly worship. That's beautiful worship. But then Mary wipes Jesus' feet with her hair. In Jesus' time, women, respectable women anyway, wore their hair up. It was only ladies of the night, should we say, who wore their hair down. And so this was a disgraceful act because it was done in public. And sometimes we need to be aware that worship, in whatever way, sometimes requires us to go beyond cultural bounds. It might make us look silly, or people may mock us because of how we worship. But worship should simply be our expression of love to God, whether that's in song or service or dance or music or whatever. It shouldn't matter what other people think. We should simply step out and worship him with all that we have. That part of the story reminds me a little bit about King David and how he danced before the ark in simply a loincloth. Of course, as king, that looked disgraceful, it looked terrible. And he was chastised by his wife for it. And he said, I will look even more disgraceful than this because I want to worship Jesus. We are all called to step beyond what is norm in order to express worship. And then we have Judas, an interesting character in the story, who looks down on Mary and says, look, we could have used that to feed the poor. He wasn't interested in the poor. He was taking money out the bag that was used to feed the poor. And we can all find ourselves being a bit like Judas. When we see people who are living life wholeheartedly for Jesus, who are worshipping on a Sunday with all of their heart, and we look at them and be judgmental about it. Maybe we should simply be looking at our own hearts and ensuring that we worship Jesus to the best of our ability and not worry about what other people are doing. Don't be a Judas when it comes to worship. Don't look down on others. And then Jesus goes into Jerusalem. And we have that great story, the Palm Sunday story. Whole crowds there, all for the Passover festival. And when they hear that Jesus is coming, they start to wave branches in the air and they start to sing and they start to shout. What a scene that must have been. But there's all sorts of people here. There are simply those who are the followers of Jesus. They know who he is, they know what he's doing, and they want to welcome Jesus into Jerusalem. There are those who are the curious. We see that, don't we? That many people had heard he'd performed miracles and so wanted to see what he was like. So there's the curious who are there, the searching. There are those who are simply caught up with what was going on, who perhaps had never heard of Jesus, didn't even know what he'd done, but because the city was so full of people from all over the world, not all of them would have heard of Jesus. They're there doing the whole kind of worship thing. And then there's the despisers, the chief priests and the Pharisees, who are looking judgmentally, condemningly over what's going on. You know, when we get into a crowd, and it's a while since we've been in a crowd, isn't it? We can get caught up with what's going on with worship. Maybe you've experienced that on a Sunday morning. There's both a positive and a negative to this. On those days when we feel like it's hard to worship, those around us worshipping Jesus with all of their heart, they're the ones who can sometimes lift us to a place where we can worship. I've experienced that myself often on a Sunday morning when I just think, here I go, I've got to lead another service, whatever. And then as I've heard you guys all singing, it's just lifted my heart so I can turn my eyes towards Jesus. There is something about being caught up with others in worship. But also, the downside is we don't simply want it to be that, do we? It's easy to get caught up in doing something that we're not sure about. And of course, some of this same crowd were the ones who shouted, "Crucify him," just a couple of days later. They got caught up with another act that was part of the whole crowd, the whole herd thing. If we're to worship, there's no problem being encouraged by others worshipping to lift your heart to Jesus. But that should only be an occasional thing when we're struggling to worship. Our place of worship starts in our hearts, in our home, and on a Sunday morning when we gather together, and one day we will. Sundays should be us all expressing our worship to Jesus out of what he has done for us. And we've spent time reflecting on it and thinking about it. And we don't need to get caught up with the whole event because worship is what we want to do. Don't simply get caught up with the event. Make sure you are caught up with Jesus and allow him to lead you into worship. We're going to finish there, and I want to pray for you. Lord, I pray that for all my friends who are watching this now, that they may know something of your love for them, and that out of that they may worship you. Help them, Lord, to see your salvation, your majesty, your beauty. Help them, Lord, to understand all that you have done for them. Not just 2,000 years ago, but even today, what you are doing for them. And Lord, out of that, let them worship you extravagantly and beautifully and disgracefully. Amen. Do please join us tomorrow for our next edition.